Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight we uncover a true and unsettling story from 1861, the life of Hagar Ashford, a giant woman whose sharp intelligence made her impossible to break, no matter the chains placed on her. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value deeply researched, fact-check true stories like this. Please subscribe, because finding real historical records behind forgotten lives like Hagar's takes countless hours of hard work, and your support keeps these stories alive. The year 1861 marked one of the darkest and most turbulent turning points in American history. It was the year the Civil War erupted, tearing the nation apart over slavery, power, and human ownership. Southern states began seceding from the Union, determined to preserve an economy built on forced labor, while the North resisted the expansion of slavery into new territories. For millions of enslaved people, this was not a political debate, it was a daily fight for survival. In this era, enslaved individuals were legally classified as property, not people. They could be bought, sold, traded, punished, or separated from family without consent. Women faced an even harsher reality. Beyond physical labor, they were expected to submit mentally, emotionally, and socially. Intelligence in an enslaved woman was often seen as a threat, something to be crushed before it inspired resistance in others. The social structure of 1861 was rigid and brutal. Plantation owners, traders, and overseers enforced obedience through violence, humiliation, and psychological control. Laws offered no protection to the enslaved. Courts did not recognize their testimony. Education for them was forbidden in many states, as literacy was considered dangerous. Knowledge meant awareness, and awareness could lead to rebellion. It was also a time obsessed with physical difference. People with unusual height, strength, or appearance were often feared, exploited, or displayed like curiosities. A woman of extraordinary size stood out immediately, drawing attention not just for her labor potential, but for the fear she inspired. In a society that demanded invisibility and submission from enslaved women, standing out was dangerous. Economically, the internal slave trade was booming. As cotton production expanded westward, enslaved people were constantly moved, sold and resold. Being sold multiple times was common, but being sold repeatedly because one refused to submit mentally was far more rare. Each sale was meant to break the person, placing them in harsher conditions until obedience was forced. 1861 was also a year of uncertainty and fear among slaveholders. Rumors of abolition, uprisings, and war made them more ruthless. Defiance was punished swiftly. Intelligence was monitored closely. Anyone who questioned orders, resisted control, or showed leadership qualities was labeled troublesome and often sold away. It is within this violent, unstable, and deeply oppressive world that Hagar Ashford's story begins. To understand her defiance, her repeated sales, and the fear she inspired, one must first understand the cruelty of the system she lived under, a system that could tolerate strength, but never intelligence paired with refusal to submit. Hagar Ashford was not simply remembered for her size, she was remembered because she refused to be reduced to it. Born into enslavement in the early 19th century, Hagar entered a world that had already decided her value before she could speak her first words. Like countless others, she was considered property from birth, her future measured in labor and obedience. But what set Hagar apart was not just her towering physical presence, it was her mind. From a young age, Hagar displayed an unusual awareness of her surroundings. She listened carefully, observed silently, and learned quickly. Though enslaved people were often denied formal education, intelligence could not be fully suppressed. Hagar understood patterns, how power worked, how fear was used, and how words could wound or unsettle those who believed themselves superior. This awareness made her dangerous in the eyes of those who owned her. Physically, Hagar was described as exceptionally tall and strong for a woman of her time. In an era when most women were expected to be small, quiet, and invisible, her presence alone disrupted social expectations. She could not blend into the background even if she wanted to. Wherever she was taken, fields, markets, or holding pens, eyes followed her. Some saw profit, others saw threat. Very few saw a human being. But Hagar was more than a body meant for labor. She questioned orders, not always aloud, but through her posture, her gaze, and her refusal to display fear. She did not beg. She did not shrink. She did not perform the obedience that was expected of enslaved women to survive. This refusal was often interpreted as arrogance or rebellion, labels that followed her from one owner to the next. Those who encountered Hagar often underestimated her at first, assuming strength meant simplicity. They were wrong. She remembered names, conversations, and injustices. She understood when promises were lies. She recognized when punishment was meant to humiliate rather than correct. This made her deeply unsettling to overseers and traders who relied on psychological dominance to maintain control. Hagar Ashford was not a revolutionary with weapons, nor a runaway who disappeared into legend. Her resistance was quieter, more dangerous in its own way. She resisted by remaining herself, by thinking, by refusing to internalize the belief that she was inferior, and by never surrendering her sense of identity. In a system designed to erase individuality, Hagar's greatest act of defiance was simply knowing who she was. To understand Hagar Ashford is to understand that power does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from an unbreakable mind, one that refuses to submit, even when the body is chained. Hagar Ashford's body alone challenged the world she was born into. In the early 1800s, the average woman stood well under 5.5 feet tall, shaped by hard labor, poor nutrition, and rigid expectations of femininity. Hagar, however, towered over many around her. Her height was extraordinary for a woman of that era, and it made her impossible to ignore. Wherever she stood, she dominated the space, not by choice, but by nature. This physical presence was a double-edged curse. To slave traders and plantation owners, her size represented profit. A tall, strong body meant endurance, strength, and the ability to perform grueling labor that broke others. She was often examined like livestock, measured by arms, legs, and shoulders, her humanity stripped away in favor of what her body could produce. Her height increased her market value, but it also increased scrutiny. To overseers, Hagar's size created fear. A woman who was physically imposing disrupted the established order, where power was supposed to flow in only one direction. Even if she never raised a hand, her presence alone unsettled those who relied on intimidation. A towering enslaved woman who did not lower her eyes or bow her head became a silent challenge to authority. Among the enslaved community, Hagar's stature carried a different meaning. Some saw protection in her presence, a figure who seemed unbreakable, someone who might endure when others could not. Others worried that her visibility would bring punishment to those around her. In a system where survival often depended on invisibility, being seen was dangerous, and Hagar was always seen. Her body was also used against her in more subtle ways. Owners expected her to perform beyond human limits, assuming strength meant lack of pain. Exhaustion, injury, and illness were dismissed. She was worked harder, pushed longer, and punished more severely when she did not meet impossible expectations. Her size became justification for cruelty. Yet Hagar did not carry her height with shame. She did not attempt to fold herself smaller or apologize for the space she occupied. She stood upright, even when beaten down. This refusal to physically submit, to hunch, to cower, to shrink, was read as defiance. In a society that demanded smallness from women and obedience from the enslaved, Hagar offered neither. Her unusual height was not just a physical trait, it became a symbol. To those who sought to control her, it was a problem to be managed. To those who witnessed her, it was a reminder that not all strength could be bent. Hagar Ashford's body told a story before she ever spoke, a story of power, fear, and a presence that could not be erased, long before Hagar Ashford was labeled troublesome or unmanageable. There were signs that her mind did not bend easily. As a young girl, she learned quickly by watching rather than speaking. In a world where enslaved people were punished for curiosity, silence became her shield. She listened to conversations between owners, traders, and overseers, absorbing more than they ever realized. This quiet awareness was the first hint of the intelligence that would later define her fate. Hagar noticed patterns others missed. She understood which commands were meant to maintain order and which were driven by fear or cruelty. She learned the rhythms of plantation life, when tempers flared, when rules tightened, and when small acts of resistance could slip through unnoticed. This awareness allowed her to navigate danger with precision, choosing when to comply and when to stand firm. Her defiance did not always come in loud rebellion. Often, it appeared in subtler forms that unsettled those in power. She asked questions when questions were not expected. She paused before obeying, forcing overseers to confront her as a thinking person rather than a tool. She met eyes instead of lowering her gaze. These small acts, insignificant on their own, accumulated into a reputation that followed her wherever she was sold. As she grew older, Hagar's intelligence became impossible to ignore. She remembered instructions perfectly, repeated words back accurately, and recognized contradictions in what she was told. Owners who prided themselves on dominance found this deeply uncomfortable. An enslaved woman who could think, remember, and reason challenged the myth that justified her enslavement. Punishments came early and often, meant to break this mental resistance, but instead of producing submission, they sharpened her awareness. Hagar learned that fear was a tool, not a truth. She understood that cruelty was often a sign of weakness in those who wielded it. This realization hardened her resolve, even as it made her situation more dangerous. What frightened slaveholders most was not that Hagar might run or fight. It was that she inspired thought. Others watched her. They saw how she stood, how she spoke, how she refused to perform humiliation. In a system that relied on silence and internalized obedience, Hagar's intelligence was contagious. These early signs of defiance marked her path long before she understood the consequences. Each thoughtful pause, each unbowed look, each moment of mental resistance pushed her further outside the role she was expected to play. And in a world that could tolerate physical strength, but not intellectual independence, Hagar Ashford's mind became the greatest threat of all. In the world Hagar Ashford lived in, obedience was not just expected, it was essential to the survival of the system itself. Enslavement depended on the belief that those held in chains accepted their position. Any sign of independent thought threatened to expose the lie at the heart of slavery. For someone like Hagar, obedience was demanded with particular intensity because everything about her challenged control. As an enslaved woman, Hagar was expected to embody silence, humility, and submission. Women were considered easier to dominate, their resistance assumed to be minimal. But Hagar's intelligence and commanding presence contradicted this stereotype. Her refusal to behave meekly made her a living contradiction, and contradictions are dangerous to oppressive systems. Slaveholders feared influence. They understood that one defiant individual could plant ideas in others, ideas about dignity, resistance, and self-worth. Hagar did not need to give speeches or organize revolts. Simply existing without visible fear was enough. If others saw that she could endure punishment without surrendering her sense of self, they might begin to question their own chains. Obedience was also tied directly to economics. A compliant enslaved person was predictable, efficient, and profitable. A thinking one was not. Hagar questioned orders, slowed work by refusing blind compliance, and disrupted the illusion of total control. Each act of hesitation or refusal was seen as lost profit and potential rebellion. There was also fear rooted in her physicality. A woman of extraordinary size who did not submit mentally terrified overseers. They relied on psychological dominance more than physical force. If that dominance failed, their authority was exposed as fragile. Demanding obedience from Hagar became a way to reassure themselves that power still rested in their hands. Religion and social norms were weaponized to enforce submission. Passages were twisted to teach that obedience was divinely ordained, that resistance was sinful. Hagar was pressured to internalize shame, to believe her thoughts were wrong, and her defiance unnatural. But she did not accept these narratives. Her mind remained her own. Ultimately, obedience was demanded of Hagar because she represented possibility, the possibility that chains could restrain the body without conquering the mind. And for those who built their power on total domination, that possibility was intolerable. Hagar Ashford's first sale marked the moment when her intelligence officially became a problem rather than a curiosity. Up until then, her defiance had been managed through punishment and surveillance. But when it became clear that she would not mentally submit, her owner chose the most common solution used against difficult, enslaved people. She was sold. Being sold was not merely a transfer of ownership, it was a weapon. The sale was meant to erase familiarity, destroy any sense of stability, and remind Hagar that she had no control over her life. She was taken from a place she had learned to navigate, from people who understood her presence, and thrown into the unknown. This sudden displacement was intended to shock her into obedience. At the auction or private sale, Hagar was inspected, discussed, and evaluated like merchandise. Her height and strength were advertised as advantages, while her attitude was framed as a flaw that could be corrected with firmer discipline. Buyers believed that a new environment, harsher rules, or stricter punishment would succeed where others had failed. The consequences of this first sale were immediate and severe. Hagar was placed under closer watch, given heavier workloads, and tested constantly for compliance. Every movement was scrutinized. Any pause, any look interpreted as resistance, brought swift punishment. The new owner was determined to prove dominance, not just over Hagar, but over the idea that an enslaved woman could resist control. Emotionally, the sale carried its own violence. Forced separation reinforced the message that attachments were dangerous, that nothing and no one could be held on to. This was designed to isolate Hagar, to make her feel alone and powerless. But instead of breaking her, it hardened her understanding of the system she faced. What her sellers failed to anticipate was that this first sale sharpened Hagar's clarity. She saw that obedience would never earn safety, only temporary relief. Submission did not guarantee mercy. The sale revealed the truth. She was punished not for what she did, but for who she was. This realization changed everything. The first sale did not silence Hagar, it confirmed her resistance. and in doing so, it set a pattern that would follow her for years to come, as one sale after another was used in a futile attempt to crush a mind that refused to bend. After the first sale failed to produce the obedience her owners demanded, Hagar Ashford was branded with a reputation that would haunt her for years: unmanageable. In the brutal economy of slavery, this label carried consequences. When punishment, isolation, and increased labor did not break her will, the solution was repeated again and again: sell her away. Each sale followed the same cruel logic. Owners believed defiance was the result of environment, not character. They convinced themselves that the problem was leniency, not Hagar's refusal to surrender her mind. A new buyer, stricter rules, harsher discipline, surely that would work. And so she was passed along, not because she lacked value, but because she threatened control. Ironically, every sale increased her monetary worth while decreasing her chances of stability. Her size and strength kept her desirable in the market, but her intelligence made her dangerous to keep. Buyers were warned, sometimes quietly, that she was smart, headstrong, or not easily ruled. Some saw this as a challenge, others believed fear could be taught. With each transfer, Hagar entered a new world of expectations. New overseers tested boundaries. New owners attempted dominance rituals, humiliation, excessive punishment, public displays of authority. These were meant to erase her identity and force compliance. Instead, they only confirmed what Hagar already knew. The system relied on repetition because it lacked imagination. The repeated sales were also strategic. Selling her removed a disruptive presence from a plantation before others could be influenced by her resistance. It sent a message to those left behind: defiance leads to loss, separation, and uncertainty. Hagar became an example, a warning carried from place to place. Yet the outcome was always the same. Hagar worked, endured, and survived, but she did not submit. She followed orders when necessary, but never surrendered her sense of self. This frustrated owners who expected gratitude for restraint or fear in response to violence. When obedience failed to appear, so did patience. Being sold over and over was meant to erase her humanity through constant disruption. But paradoxically, it revealed something powerful. No matter where she was taken, she remained herself. 12 sales were not a sign of her weakness. They were evidence of the system's failure to conquer a single, unyielding mind. To be sold once in slavery was trauma. To be sold repeatedly was a deliberate strategy of destruction. For Hagar Ashford, being sold 9 times was not coincidence. It was a message. Each sale was meant to strip her of identity, memory, and resistance until nothing remained but obedience. That it happened 12 times reveals not her failure, but the system's desperation. In the slave economy, repeated sales usually signaled one of two things: physical weakness or mental defiance. Hagar was not weak. Her body was strong, her labor valuable. That left only one explanation: she could not be controlled in the way owners demanded. 12 times, different men believed they could succeed where others had failed. 12 times, they were wrong. Every sale was intended to reset her. New surroundings, new rules, new threats. Familiar faces were removed. Any sense of belonging was erased. This constant upheaval was psychological warfare. It was designed to convince her that resistance led only to endless suffering. That stability could only be earned through submission. But the number 12 carries a darker implication. It shows how thoroughly Hagar was tested. 12 different owners, 12 different systems of punishment, 12 chances for fear to win. The fact that she endured them all without surrendering her mind exposes a truth slaveholders refuse to accept: control has limits. Being sold 12 times also turned Hagar into a legend within the trade networks. Stories followed her. She became known not just as large or strong, but as a woman who could not be broken. Some buyers avoided her. Others sought her out, driven by ego, believing they could tame what others could not. Each purchase was an attempt to assert dominance over more than a person. It was dominance over the idea of resistance itself. For Hagar, the meaning was painfully clear. She understood that her life would be defined by movement, loss, and endurance. Yet she also learned something else. No matter how many times she was sold, her identity remained intact. Names, places, and owners changed, but her sense of self did not. 12 sales did not erase Hagar Ashford. They documented her defiance. Each transaction became a record of failure, not hers, but of a system that could chain bodies, yet never fully conquer a determined mind. Hagar Ashford understood something many never had the chance to realize. The body can be owned, but the mind does not have to be surrendered. From the beginning, her resistance was not centered on escape or violence, but on something far more threatening to her oppressors: mental independence. No matter how many times she was sold, punished, or isolated, she refused to accept the lie that she was less than human. Mental submission was the true goal of slavery. Obedience in action was not enough. Owners demanded belief in inferiority, in powerlessness, in inevitability. Hagar denied them this victory. She followed orders when survival required it, but inside, she remained unconvinced. She did not internalize their words, their insults, or their attempts to redefine her worth. This refusal appeared in quiet, unsettling ways. She did not beg for mercy. She did not express gratitude for reduced punishment. She did not perform fear. Her calm under pressure unnerved overseers more than open rebellion ever could. Punishment was meant to humiliate, yet Hagar endured it without allowing it to reshape her identity. Even isolation failed to break her. When separated from others, denied conversation, or moved repeatedly to unfamiliar places, she used solitude as a space for thought rather than despair. She remembered who she was, where she had been, and why she resisted. Memory became an act of defiance. What frightened slaveholders most was that Hagar could not be taught self-hatred. She recognized cruelty as cruelty, not as justice or destiny. This awareness prevented the system from completing its work. Without mental submission, obedience was always temporary and fragile. Her refusal to surrender her mind turned every owner into a temporary figure in her life, rather than a master of her identity. They could dictate her movements, but not her meaning. In a system built on psychological domination, Hagar Ashford's unbroken mind stood as the ultimate act of resistance. In the 19th century, intelligence in women was often viewed with suspicion. In an enslaved woman, it was seen as outright dangerous. Society was built on rigid hierarchies: men over women, white over black, owner over enslaved. An intelligent woman threatened every layer of that structure at once. Hagar Ashford existed at the intersection of all these fears. Intelligent women disrupted expectations. They asked questions, noticed contradictions, and refused to accept explanations rooted in tradition rather than truth. For slave-holding society, this was intolerable. The system depended on women being passive, compliant, and silent. Hagar was none of these. Her awareness made it impossible to reduce her to a simple role. There was also fear of influence. An intelligent woman could shape how others thought, not through force, but through example. Hagar did not need to preach resistance. Others saw how she carried herself, how she endured punishment without internal collapse, how she maintained dignity in dehumanizing conditions. This kind of strength spread quietly, undermining authority from within. Slaveholders were particularly threatened by women who could not be psychologically controlled. Physical punishment could suppress action, but intelligence allowed memory, comparison, and judgment. Hagar remembered how different owners behaved, how rules changed to suit power, and how order was often just cruelty with a justification. This made manipulation harder. Religion and pseudo-science were often used to justify fear of intelligent women. Claims of natural inferiority were repeated to maintain control. Hagar's very existence contradicted these claims. She was observant, rational, and emotionally resilient, traits denied to her by the ideology that enslaved her. The fear extended beyond slavery. Even free women who displayed intelligence were often labeled disruptive or unnatural. For an enslaved woman, the consequences were harsher. Intelligence became a crime. Curiosity became rebellion. Thought became threat. Hagar Ashford terrified society, not because she sought power, but because she proved something undeniable: intelligence cannot be owned. And in a world that depended on owning everything about a person, that truth was more frightening than any act of open defiance. Hagar Ashford's life existed at the sharp edge between exploitation and dignity, a line slavery tried relentlessly to erase. Every system she lived under was designed to extract value from her body, while denying the humanity of her mind. She was measured in strength, endurance, and price, yet never acknowledged as a thinking, feeling individual. This contradiction defined her suffering. Exploitation was systematic. Hagar's unusual height and strength were used to justify harsher labor and greater expectations. Pain was dismissed as weakness. Exhaustion was treated as defiance. Her body was pushed beyond human limits because it was seen as an asset rather than a life. Each owner believed they had the right to take more, give less, and punish freely. Human dignity, in contrast, was something Hagar carried internally. It was not granted to her, it was claimed. She asserted it through posture, through silence, through refusal to perform humiliation. Even when stripped of control over her own movements, she maintained control over how she understood herself. This internal dignity was invisible to markets and contracts, but it was real. The repeated sales highlighted this tension. Each transaction reduced her to a price, yet each failure to control her reaffirmed her humanity. The system exploited her labor, but it could not exploit her conscience. Owners attempted to break dignity through degradation, forcing obedience, enforcing shame, demanding gratitude. Hagar refused these narratives. What made her especially threatening was that dignity did not require permission. She did not need recognition to possess it. This exposed the moral emptiness of exploitation. If dignity could survive under such conditions, then the system itself stood condemned. Hagar Ashford's life forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth: exploitation thrives only when dignity is surrendered. By refusing to surrender it, she transformed suffering into resistance. Her story is not just about what was taken from her, but about what could not be taken at all. Hagar Ashford survived not because the world was kind to her, but because her mind developed a strength that cruelty could not erode. Her psychological resilience became her defining trait, more powerful than her physical stature and more threatening than open rebellion. It was this inner strength that allowed her to endure what was meant to destroy her. Psychological strength, for Hagar, meant clarity. She understood the difference between power and justice, between punishment and truth. This clarity protected her from internalizing the lies spoken over her daily, that she was inferior, that she deserved her suffering, that obedience was her natural state. She recognized these as tools of control, not reflections of reality. She also mastered emotional restraint. while others were pushed into despair or rage, responses that invited harsher punishment. Hagar learned to remain composed. This calm was not submission, it was strategy. By denying her oppressors' emotional reactions, she denied them satisfaction and control. Her silence became a form of power. Memory played a crucial role in her psychological endurance. Hagar remembered each injustice, not to be consumed by it, but to understand the system she faced. She noticed patterns, learned what to expect, and adapted without surrendering her core identity. Forgetting was what slavery demanded, remembering was her resistance. Isolation, meant to break her, often strengthened her resolve. Alone, she reflected rather than collapsed. She reaffirmed who she was, even when everything around her attempted to redefine her. This internal dialogue kept her anchored through constant displacement and loss. Above all, Hagar's psychological strength lay in her refusal to let suffering define her worth. Pain was something inflicted upon her, not something that described her. This distinction preserved her sense of self when everything else was stripped away. In a system that relied on mental domination, Hagar Ashford's unshakable inner world became her greatest act of defiance, and the reason she could be sold again and again without ever being truly owned. Hagar Ashford's story does not end with her being sold, beaten, or displaced. It endures as a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. While history often erases the lives of those enslaved, her life has survived in records, whispers, and retellings because it embodies something larger than herself: the power of intelligence, dignity, and mental freedom in the face of oppression. Her legacy is rooted in the fact that she refused to submit mentally, even when submission seemed like the only path to safety. Every sale, every punishment, every attempt to erase her identity failed. This makes her more than a historical curiosity. It makes her a symbol. Hagar represents all those who are forced into systems that seek to dehumanize, but who refuse to let their minds and spirits be chained. In a society built to enforce compliance, her life demonstrated that true power lies not in the oppressor's control over the body, but in the individual's mastery over their mind. Hagar's resistance was subtle yet profound. It did not rely on violence or escape, but on an unyielding commitment to selfhood. In this way, she offers a lesson that resonates far beyond her time. The mind can remain free even when the body is enslaved. Her story has also inspired later generations to reconsider how history records courage. Often, history celebrates victories in war or revolutions, but Hagar's struggle shows that defiance in everyday survival is equally heroic. By surviving repeated sales and refusing to internalize oppression, she created a narrative of quiet rebellion, one that challenges the idea that power is defined solely by physical dominance or societal approval. Hagar Ashford's legacy is, therefore, twofold. First, it preserves the memory of a woman whose intelligence and dignity could not be broken. Second, it serves as a symbol for resistance against any system that seeks to devalue or control the human spirit. She reminds us that courage is not only in action, but also in thought, resilience, and the refusal to let oppression define who we are. Her life story continues to inspire those who study the past, highlighting that even under unimaginable hardship, the human mind can remain unconquered, a legacy that echoes through history as a beacon of strength, awareness, and resistance.